911. What's your emergency?
Yeah, hi, it's gonna kinda sound strange, but there's a man stumbling around in a circle in front of my yard.
Could you repeat that, sir?
He looks sick or drunk or something. I just woke up for a glass of water. I heard some snow crunching around underneath my front window, so I peeked out and I'm looking at him now, and he's about 10 yards away from my window. Something's not right.
What's your address, sir?
1617 Quarry Lane in Lavender Town.
Okay, I'm going to send a squad car on your way, but that's quite a way out. Are you alone in your house, sir?
Yes, I'm alone.
Can you confirm that all the doors and windows are locked? Stay on the phone with me.
I know that my front door is definitely locked, but I'll go check the door again really quick. I appreciate your help. By the way, I know this is kind of strange, but I really hope that...
Sir, are you still there?
He's still in the yard. What the fuck? He's upside down.
Sir, stay on with me. What is happening?
He's staring right at me, but he's standing on his hands now. He's perfectly still, staring straight at me. He's doing a handstand and he's smiling at me and not moving.
Doing a handstand, sir?
I don't know. Yeah, he's facing upside down and his hands, and he's just this huge smile and he's perfectly still. What the fuck? Please get someone out here now.
Sir, I need you to remain calm. I put out the call and an officer is on his way.
His teeth are so huge. What the fuck? Please help me.
Sir, I want you to try and keep an eye on him, but make sure your back door is locked again. We need to make sure all possible access points are secured. Can you talk to me through and confirm that your back door is locked?
Okay, I'm walking backwards now, and I'm keeping him in my sight. My hand is on the back doorknob now. It's locked. I need to check the deadbolt, but so I'm going to make my eyes off him for now. A split second.
Alright, sir. Help is on the way. Just stay on the phone with me. Everything is going to be okay. Sir? Sir, are you still there?
His face is against the glass.
Sir, I need you to speak up. What is happening?
I looked away for a split second now. His face, it pressed against the window and his teeth are huge. He's still smiling. There's no color in his eyes. Jesus, please help me. Why won't he fucking move?
Sir, I need you to go to the nearest room and lock yourself inside of it. Do you have a basement or a bedroom that you can lock yourself in?
He won't stop staring. He's going to hurt me.
Sir, I need you to listen to me. Lock yourself somewhere safe until the officer arrives at your house. Can you hear me?
Yes. I'm going to lock myself in my room.
And you're positive that you're alone in your house, correct?
Yes, I'm alone in the house. Wait a moment. He's moving. He's shaking his head. He's telling me, no, he can hear us. He's telling me I'm not alone.
Sir, you're still there. I hear a loud noise. Is everything alright? Sir.
Where bad kids go. I must have been 6 or 7 when I lived in Lebanon. The country was ravaged by war at the time, and murders were common and frequent. I remember during a particular vicious era, when the bombing rarely stopped. I would stay at home, sitting in front of my television, watching a very very strange show. It was a kids' show that lasted about 30 minutes and contained strange and sinister images. To this day, I believe it was a thinly veiled attempt on the part of the media to use scare tactics to keep us kids in our place. Because the moral of every episode revolved around very uptight ideologies. Stuff like, bad kids stay up late. Bad kids have their hands under the covers when they sleep. And bad kids steal food from the fridge at night. It was very weird, and in Arabic to top it off. I didn't believe or understand much of it, but the most part of the image was very graphic and comprehensive. The thing that stuck with me the most, however, was the closing scene. It remains much the same in every episode. The camera would zoom in an odd old rusted closet door. As it get closer to the door, strange and sometimes even antagonizing screams would become more audible. It was extremely frightening, especially for children programming. Then a text would appear on the screen in Arabic reading, "That's where bad kids go." Eventually, both image on the sound would fade out. And that would be the end of the episode. About 15 or 16 years later, I became a journalist photographer. That showed had been in my mind all my life, popping up in my thoughts sporadically. Eventually, I had thoughts and decided to do some research. I finally managed to uncover the location of the studio where much of the channel programming had been recorded. Upon further research, and eventually traveled on site, I found out it was now a desolate and had been abandoned after the big war ended. I entered the building with my camera. It was burnt out from the inside. Either a fire had broken out or someone had wanted to incinerate all the wooden furniture. After a few hours unconsciously making my way into the studio and snapping pictures, I found a isolated out-of-the-way room. After having to break through the few old blocks and manage to break a heavy door open, I managed to be frozen in the doorway for several long minutes. Traces of blood, feces, and tiny bone fragments laid scattered across the floor. It was a small room, and an extremely morbid scene. What truly frightened me, though, what made me turn away and never want to come back, was the bolted cage microphone hanging from the ceiling of the middle of the room. When I was 12, I came to the conclusion that everyone in the world, including my own family, was against me. I was never a problem child, but my parents sure treated me like one. For example, I used to need to be by home by 5 p.m. every day. This clearly restricted my amount of playtime outdoors. I wasn't allowed to have friends over to play at the house, nor I was allowed to go over anyone else. I had to finish my homework directly after I came home from school, no matter how long it took. My parents refused to buy me video games and forced me to read books and then write books reports on them to prove I can actually read it. Now, even though those rules listed above were quite frustrating to me as a child, they aren't what upsets me the most. What really hurts me was the lack of compassion on behalf of my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty about accidents or mistakes I've made. My father only knew one emotion: frustration. The only time he spoke to me was when he screamed at me for receiving poor test scores or beat me for my misbehavings. But enough about them. Let's talk about my school's psychologist. For his very own privacy, we will call him Dr. Tanner. Like most junior high schools, a psychologist is always available on campus during school hours to assist with any student in need of counseling, whether it's emotional, academic, social, behavior, etc. To be honest, I have never seen any students talking to Dr. Tanner. Every day I would walk past his office on my way to the cafeteria and peek through his little window. He would always be alone in there, working on some paperwork. I guess that most kids were too afraid to speak about their problems to an adult who was practically a stranger. For this reason, it took me 3 weeks to muster enough courage to go to his office. March 2nd, 1993 was the day I decided to voice my troubles to Dr. Tanner. During lunch break, of course, I stood in front of his office door and knocked. Through the window, I could see him raise his head, smile, and motion for me to come in. I did. He greeted me by introducing himself and asking for my name. Dr. Tanner was a very soft-spoken man who seemed to radiate kindness in less than 30 minutes. I rambled to Dr. Tanner about how mean my parents were to me, and they didn't care about me at all. After a while, my voice began to quiver, and I stopped speaking. The psychologist listened patiently to my whole spiel. Arms folded and head nodding. I half expected him to begin talking about it, how everything I just said was untrue and that my parents loved me dearly and blah blah blah. But he didn't. Dr. Tanner leaned towards me with a grin on his face and said, "You know, I'm the best school psychologist in this world. I promise we will fix this." I rolled my eyes. "Okay, but how?" I asked. "I have my ways," he replied. "I'm a man of my word. I promise that within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better, forever." After a brief pause, he continued, "Although I do need you to make me a promise." You have to promise me that you'll come back to my office after school and that you won't tell anyone that we had this conversation today. It'll be a little secret. I promise. Following day, I returned to Dr. Tanner after school. It was around 4 p.m. when I enter his office. After a warm welcome, he asked me to have a seat in front of his desk once again. Upon sitting down, I watched Dr. Tanner close the blinds of the door's tiny window. There, he smiled. Now we have all the privacy we need. We began to talk about my likes and interests, my favorite subjects in school, my least favorite teacher, and things of the like. About an hour into the conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a soft drink. I gladly took the offer. Considering my parents never allow me to drink soda, Dr. Tanner reached over to his mini fridge and fidgeted around before sitting down and 2 open cans of sodas on his desk. Afterwards, we continued to talk about what was going on in my life. But it wasn't long before I passed out from whatever drugs Dr. Tanner placed in my drink. It took me a minute or so to adjust my blurred vision upon waking. And when I did, I had no idea what to think. I was handcuffed to the bed, and my mouth was sealed with duct tape. I immediately began to panic, squirming and tugging at the cuffs, but gave up soon after. My eyes widened in disbelief after looking around the room. There were posters of superheroes pinned up along the walls and photographs of famous athletes on the shelves. In the middle of the room was an old television and a Super Nintendo, various game cartridges stacked alongside it. I didn't know what to think. Here I am in my room filled with items most kids would die to play with. I would have probably cried from joy hadn't I had been handcuffed to the bed frame. My stomach sank once again as the door opened and Dr. Tanner walked inside. He sat down on the edge of the bed. Now listen, he said. Remember that I'm here to help you, and I would never hurt you, okay? Dr. Tanner gently removed the tape from my mouth, and then the cuff from my hands. My first instinct was to begin to cry, but something about Dr. Tanner made me feel safe. He smiled at me. You're going to be staying here for a while, he continued. And during this time, you're allowed to play with any toys in this room while I'm here at home. But when I leave the house, I'll need to cuff you with one of your hands back to the bed. You can still watch TV, but I want you to only watch the news channels when I'm away. I sat in silence, still trying to process the information he had given me. So? Dr. Tanner yipped, slapping me on the knee. You go ahead and knock yourself out. I'll be back when it's time for dinner. He got up from the bed, walked across the room, and clicked the TV's power button before locking the door behind him. Several more minutes passed before I realized Dr. Tanner wasn't joking. All that was left for me to do was boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. At about 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned to the room carrying 2 plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally gathered up the courage to ask him about how long I'll be staying in this room. Well, about a month, he replied. Give or take a few weeks. I just have some work I need to do. The following morning, I awoke to Dr. Tanner's hand patting my head. Hey bud, you don't have to wake up right now if you don't want. But I am going to need to put this back on, he whispered, clamping the cold steel of handcuffs onto my wrist. I gazed up at him. He was wearing a collared shirt and slacks, a coat draped over his shoulder, and a suitcase at his side. He looked just how he always did when I saw him around school. Before leaving, he placed the TV's remote next to me and told me to turn it on and watch the news. The first thing I saw upon turning on the TV was a breaking news segment. An important-looking police officer stood at a podium surrounded by people with microphones. I happened to begin viewing halfway through his speech. A statewide Amber Alert has been issued as of this morning. We have several investigations working towards identifying a potential abductor. But as of right now, there is not much evidence. Full team members state that the boy had been last seen around 4 or 5 in the evening on. I began to feel nauseous as a photograph of me appeared on the screen. It was my yearbook picture from last year. Captions for the photograph displayed my name and age, my school, and my own town. Above my picture was alternating titles. FBI began searching for child and kidnapping suspect unknown and potential runaway. Live footage continued as 2 figures I soon to recognize as my mom and dad stepped to the podium. Both appeared to have reddened eyes. Tears steamed down my mother's face as she took hold of a microphone. I never seen such emotion come from my mother before. She wept in the live television, shuddering on a sentence such as, "Please return my baby back to me, and I'm so sorry, and please come back home to us." When my father took the microphone, I nearly expected his attitude to be stone cold, but he had tears in his eyes. He pleaded to the world to bring his son home safely, and lastly, begged for my forgiveness. I know I haven't been the best father, but goddamn, I do wish I had been now. Please bring back my boy. I turned the power off shortly after. My emotions were mixed, for I had never seen once my father cry. I felt miserable that my parents were being put through so much, but at the same time I felt relief. I now know how much my mom and dad loves me. Nearly 4 weeks have passed, and Dr. Tanner had been treating me with the utmost respect. He leaves me in the morning cuffed to the bed frame, but returns in the afternoon to eat lunch and dinner with me, talk and play games. I never would have guessed how Dr. Tanner was a Monopoly and Scrabble. But one morning when Dr. Tanner woke me before heading off to work, I noticed a stern look on his face. I also realized that it was 3 hours early than when he usually wakes me up. You need to watch the news today. No exceptions. I want you to keep the television on all day and pay close attention to it, he stated grimly. I, of course, complied and watched him exit the room. About 2 hours later, a breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I was watching. The title, Human Remnants Found. 2 men looking in suits stood aside one another and began speaking. We are displeased to bring you such unfortunate news this morning regarding of our missing child case from earlier this month. One of the men bowed his head while the one speaking shuffled through some papers. He continued. The remnants of the body had been found in a garbage bag beneath a highway overpass. The body appears to be that of a child, although not much of it is left. The body had been decapitated, and much had been burned to ash and bones. The screen shifted over to the helicopter view on the freeway. Dozens of police cars gathered near the bottom of the tall overpass. The man's voice could still be heard. Within the bag, police found a junior high school student identification card labeled as such. The screen showed the school ID card I always kept in my backpack. The plastic was sort of melted away, but my photograph and name were intact. After the 2 men dismissed themselves, the camera panned over to my parents. They were sitting among reporters, my father's face held in a painful grimace, and my father soaked his head down at his knees. I shut off the television off. Dr. Tanner returned home very late. He hurried into the room, unlocked my cuffs, and placed a bottle of fizzing water into my hand. He placed his hands onto my shoulders and smiled. I made you a promise, didn't I? I nodded, tears squeezing their way out of my eyes. You need to make me a promise again, he whispered. He told me that I need to drink all the water in the bottle. It would help me sleep, and that from here on, I am never to tell anyone that I ever met him. I promise. I told you, I'm the best school psychologist in the world, didn't I? And he was right. I awoke later that night to find myself lying in the middle of the park, stars shining brilliantly across the night sky. I recognized the park. It wasn't too far from my school. A mile or so down the road. I saw my house. The lights were off, but I could make out my father sitting on the step leading into the front door. I hesitantly called out to him. He lifted his head slowly, but when he saw me, it was me. He sprang to his feet, ran towards me with open arms, yelling out my name. My mother's erupted from the house behind him.
Dr. Tanner was right. Things have changed with my family, and my parents smile more often and treat me with loving compassion. I could not ask for more perfect ending. Every now and then, I see Dr. Tanner on campus, walking to and from his office. Rarely do we ever make eye contact, let alone speak to one another, but sometimes he'll shoot me a wink and a smile. I'll always keep my promise to him, and I pretend I never met him, but there will always be one question forever floating in my mind. Who did Dr. Tanner decapitate and throw off the overpass?
Jack-o'-lantern. After a long day of unlucky hunting, I find myself stuck in the middle of the marshlands for the night, without a flashlight or a lantern to guide my stumbling steps, so I settled beside a fallen log to rest until daylight. As I tossed and turned, I recalled the story of my great uncle told me about a ghost that haunted the marshlands. There once was a man named Jack who was a nasty fellow. He beat his wife and kids, was all around a bad chap. Jack got worse and worse as the years rolled by, but finally Jack's body got so worn out that he died. He went up to heaven, but St. Peter refused to let such a wretched fellow in. Then he went to hell, but the devil barred the door as soon as he saw Jack coming, and wouldn't let him in either. "Go away, and don't come back," the devil told Jack. "How am I supposed to get back into the dark?" Jack grumbled. "Give me a lantern." So the devil threw a chunk of molten fire out to Jack, who took it from his lantern and went back to Earth, where he wandered forever through the swamps of marshlands of the earth, a bittersweet, whose only delight was in luring the unwary to their doom with his lamp. At this juncture in my misusing, I happened to look out over to the marsh and notice a blinking light in the fog. "Is that you, Jack? Jack-o'-lantern?" I called jovially. Jack. A voice whispered back. I was seriously spooked. I clutched my gun to my chest, the hairs on my arms standing on end. Had that been an echo of my voice, or was someone out there with me? "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave and menacing. I waved my gun around. "Show yourself! At once!" Jack! 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 The voice hissed from a completely different section of the swamp. A light blinked, and then off. On, and then off. Shudders ran up my spine at the sound of a ghastly voice coming from nowhere. I huddled against the log, wanting something firm on my back. Suddenly, the story of Jack-o'-lantern didn't seem so funny. My heart was pounding so hard it made my chest hurt. I strained my ears in the silence that fell over the swamp. The voice hissed somewhere from the left this time. The light blinked on, off, on. I counted 10 heartbeats this time before it went off. The voice sounded closer. I held very still, my instinct screaming at me to hold my breath and not to move, until the menace had passed. The voice came again, far off to the right. Jack! 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 It hissed. The light came on, off, on, off. It's moving away. I thought, relaxing just a bit, feeling safer. There was a long silence. Nothing stirred. Not the wind in the grass, not the fog or turtles in the water, not a crickets or insects. Jack, Jack, Jack. The voice hissed softly, right into my ear. I looked up to the growling red eyes and twisted face of the jack-o'-lantern. I screamed and lashed out it with my gun. I ran a few steps, tripped and fell over, knocking my head on the sharp stone. For a moment I saw stars, and I felt blood pouring from my scalp. But the jack-o'-lantern was right behind me. I had to get away. I rolled and fell into a deep pool. I plunged underneath the water, falling desperately against rope, like grasses that tried to keep me down. My head finally burst out of the water, and I gasped desperately for air, treading waters and as best as I could, my trembling limbs aching head. I heard the creature laughing in the mist. Jack! 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 The voice hissed delightedly. And the light blinked on, off, on, right over my head, blinding my dazed eyes as horror flew through me and froze my limbs as so I could no longer swim. For a long moment, the grotesque face and red eyes of the jack-o'-lantern loomed out of the mist before my petrified gaze. My head started to swim with pain from my bleeding skull. The face above me, it lit its bright light, whirled around and around, growling dimmer as the eyes started to glaze. I was vaguely aware that I should keep swimming, keep trying to make my way to the edge of the pool, but the effort was too much for my suddenly heavy limbs. I barely noticed myself plunging down and down into the watery depths of the pool, too stunned by my injury to fight my way to the surface a second time. Then there was only darkness and silence, and a voice hissed in a cold triumph. Jack, Jack, Jack. The Lavender Town syndrome, also known as Lavender Town tone or Lavender Town suicides, was a peak in suicide and illness of children between the ages of 7 and 12, shortly after the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan back in February 27, 1996. Rumors say that these suicides and illnesses only occur after the children were playing in the Pokemon game Lavender Town, whose theme music had extremely high frequencies, and that studies showed that the children and young teens can hear. Since their ears are more sensitive due to the Lavender Town tone, at least 200 children supposedly committed suicide, and many more developed illness and affliction. The children who committed suicide usually did so by hanging or jumping from heights. Those who did not acted irrationally complained of severe headaches after listening to Lavender Town's theme. Although Lavender Town now sounds differently depending on the game, this mass hysteria was caused by the first Pokemon game released after the Lavender Town tone incident. The programmers had fixed Lavender Town's theme music to be low frequency, and since the children were no longer affected by it. One video appeared in 2010 using the special software
To analyze the audio of Lavender Town's music, when played, the software created an image of the unknown near the end of the audio. This raised a controversy since the unknown did appear until Generation 2, which were silver, gold, and crystal. The unknown translates to leave now. There's also to be said there is a beta version of Lavender Town out there. It is said that the beta version of Pocket Monster was released to some kids to test the game. This is the video of the beta version of Lavender Town. The Polaroid camera. Tara slammed the taxi door behind her with one hand and used the other to pull the raincoat collar tied against her neck from sharp slanted drizzle. She found herself checking for the camera dangling by its worn straps in the scramble for cover. Should have brought a tote bag at least, or a backpack to protect her from the weather, as she thought to herself, but was writing on impulse and did not want to think too hard about what she was doing here. Her boyfriend didn't believe her. Her parents didn't even believe her. The specialist at the rehabilitation center wouldn't even believe her. If she had mustered up the courage to ask a question honestly. So here Tara was, a visitor at a check-in, feeling the weight of an embarrassing plan. Something was making Grandma sicker, and fast. Just a few short weeks ago, she was cracking wise-ass jokes, eating dessert like a delicate queen in her royal bedchamber, and sly-turning her shiny dark eyes to share the secret with Tara, when Dad did that thing where he hissed at her for sitting unladylike. The memory made Tara's eyes sting. She wiped it away, ignoring the prickly hot red face felt, picking up her stride to reach the elevator door before they closed. Tara knew what it must look like to everyone. Poor Tara was losing her beloved grandma and couldn't cope. Poor Tara was struggling with the idea Grandma might not make it out of recovery, and was looking for someone, anyone to blame. Grandma stopped talking to poor Tara and took it personally. Her parents whispered words like disorienting when they thought she wasn't or couldn't hear. Her boyfriend was losing patience for emotional support. But there was something wrong. Something was more wrong than natural. Grandma seemed beyond just exhausted, drained, dying in a million unreachable miles away medication fog. She looked terror-stricken. Tara shared a tight smile with the nurse station while turning down the next hall. She needed to get her head straight, ignoring the smell of the salty urine and nauseous cherry-scented cleaner. A quick double check to make sure that the hall was all clear, as she thought suddenly made her hand clammy and her heart pounded. The door was in reach. Tara wilted
with shame. What was she expect to happen? A quiet press up to the door gave no sign Grandma was awake just yet. No TV hummed, no nurse making futile small talk. The plan was not a well thought out one by any means. Leaping into the room, camera blazing, would scare the absolute shit out of my grandma. But so what? Tara recoiled, ashamed of the thought. Was she desperately for any sort of reaction from an old woman at this point? Even at her expense. She did care, she thought. She was doing this for Grandma. Cared enough to call off work to sneak into Dad's studies, to steal his Polaroid, to purchase discounted films for it. To be shaking now? To be here at the door. It was time. Tara's grip tightened on the camera, held close to her chest, leaned and aimed high. She wiped the sweaty palms on her knees of her cortisol before grabbing the knob. 1, 2, 3. Door flung open with more force than intended. She was scared enough to close her eyes tight without meaning. Click, click, click. Press shots printed. The door hit the jamb behind it loudly. Click, click, click. The first Polaroid fluttered to the floor. The second one followed. The flash was intense. Tara heard a soft gasp from the bed. Click, click, click. The vibrating door slowly bounced back from impact, striking Tara's elbow just right, and it was then her turn to gasp. She dropped the camera as it split the last photo to the floor, clutching a sharp pain instead. Shit! She opened her eyes to meet Grandma's bewildering gaze, who was sitting up in bed, slack-jawed, silence, standing there in the doorway. In the quiet, and feeling the urge to hide any evidence of theatrics, Tara quickly gathered up the camera pieces. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I scared you, Grandma. Tara rushed to the bed to sit beside the old woman, gripping her neck in brace. The tears came shortly after. There was no movement to return it. Not usual for her grandmother these days. Tara pulled back to wipe her tears and dribble from her nose, but instead was startled to met with intense. With her hands still on the woman's shoulder, Tara watched as those cold eyes slowly trailed to the ceiling. Lips parted in perfect O. Tara followed to join them. Nothing. Foam tiles on the ceiling and gray water stain, long dried, damped, and dried again. A couple files dead in their light Fletcher tomb. Tara exhaled, looking back at the woman's face and its soft, unfamiliar smile lines around the eyes that did not lower again. Unblinking, both women sat in their separate worlds for a few moments. The unbroken stare eventually made Tara retreat uncomfortably. Releasing the shoulder she realized were probably clenched a little too hard for a hug. Feeling immensely embarrassed at the sight of the photos scattered on the floor, she set to work to clean them up. What if there had been a nurse in here after all? Such an idiot! The thought almost made her laugh while struggling to thumb the corner of the first photo off to the floor. It was 50% occupied by part of her finger. Sorry, man, just testing a theory. She did laugh then, How would she have explained any of this to another person without seeming unhinged? They would have jumped out of their skin at her barging in. The next Polaroid tossed in the bin was all blurred and bad lighting. Pardon me, nurse, I'm cracking and none of them seem to care. Tara froze then, knelt on the cold tile. She suddenly reached for the corner of the bed metal frame for support to stand, holding on too tight, way too tight, knuckles wide. In the other final development picture, Stole looked for an old woman limp, quivering, small in her hospital gown, mouth open, eyes fixed of watering now. She looked like a hungry baby bird shooting desperately, glanced from Tara to the ceiling. Tara to the ceiling. Tara back to the ceiling again. She didn't want to look, didn't want to know any more than she already did. No, she thought, ripping away from the bed to look up in time, to see a long, filthy trail of hair sliding back to the darkness of the above. Like so many creature pellets. No, she wild, watching the ceiling tile slide back into place by a set of too long, too many finger hands that had just been deeped in Grandma's throat, leaving fresh wet stains as they went. Ticci Toby. The long road home seemed to go on and on. The road continued to stretch in front of the vehicle endlessly. The light that shone through the branches of the tall, green trees danced across the window in random patterns, and every once in a while, obnoxiously shining in your eyes. The surroundings were full of deep green trees, forming a forest around the road. The only sound was the sound of the car's engine as it traveled down the path. It was peaceful, and it left serene feeling. Although the ride seemed like a nice one, it lacked every form of nice from its two passengers. The middle-aged woman behind the steering wheel had neat, short brown hair that fit her complexion quite well. She wore a green V-neck t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans. Diamond stud earrings decorated each other of her ears, which particularly showed from behind her haircut. She had a deep green eyes, which her shirt brought out, and the lighting seemed to make them more noticeable. There wasn't anything significant about her appearance. She looked like any other average mother you would see on TV shows, and the like. However, the one thing that made her different than the average mother was the dark bags she had under her eyes. Her facial expression was gloomy and sad, although she genuinely looked like someone who smiled a lot. She would sniffle every once in a while, and occasionally glanced in the rear view mirror to look at her son in the back seat, who was haunted over particularly, with his arms held tight around his chest and his head pressed against the cold window. The boy lacked any normal appearance, and anyone who could plainly see there was something wrong with him. His messy brown hair went every which way, and the luminescent lighting brought out his pale, almost gray skin. His eyes were dark, unlike his mother's, and he wore a t-shirt and a scrub pants that had been provided for him by the hospital. The clothes he had worn before were so shredded and blood-stained that they weren't even wearable anymore. The right side of his face bared a new cut along with a split eyebrow. His right arm was bandaged all the way up to the shoulder, which he had shredded when his right side hit the shattered glass. His injuries appeared to be painful, when in reality, he couldn't feel anything. This was one of the glories of being him. One of the challenges he had faced while growing up with this rare disease that caused him to be completely numb towards pain. Never before he had felt himself get hurt. He could have lost an arm and felt nothing. The other major disorder he faced, which was the one that deemed him many insulting nicknames. In the short time he attended grade school before he switched to homeschooling, was his Tourette syndrome, which caused him to tick and twitch in ways he couldn't control. He would crack his neck uncontrollably and twitch once in a while. The kids would tease him and call him Ticci Toby, and they mocked him with exaggerated twitching and laughing. It got so bad he had turned into homeschooling. It was too hard for him to be in a common learning environment with seemingly every kid poking, or more like stabbing, fun at him. Toby stared blankly out to the window, his face empty of any emotion, and every few minutes his shoulders, arm, or foot would twitch. Every bump that the car tire hits would make his stomach turn. Toby Rogers was the boy's name, and the last time Toby remembered riding in a car was when it crashed. That's all he thought about, unconsciously replaying everything he remembered before he blacked out, over and over again. Toby had been the lucky one. His sister had not been so lucky. When the thought of his sister came, he couldn't help the tears that he whelped in his eyes. The horrible memories replayed in his mind. Her screaming that had cut off when the front of the car was smashed in. It all went blank for the moment before Toby opened his eyes to see his sister's body. Her forehead pierced with the glass shards, her hips and legs crushed under the force of the steering wheel, and her torso pushed in from the two late inflated airbags. That was the last thing he had seen of his dear old sister. The road home continued on for what seemed like forever. It took so long to get home because his mom wanted to avoid the sight of the crash. When the surroundings gave way to a familiar neighborhood, they were both more than ready to get out of the car and step back into their own home. It was an older neighborhood with a quaint little house, all next to each other. The car drove in front of the blue house with a white window panel. They both quickly noticed the old vehicle that was parked in front of the house and the familiar figure that stood in the driveway. Toby felt automatic anger and frustration take over him at the sight of his own father. His father who wasn't there. "Why is he here?" Toby said quietly as he looked back at his mother who reached to open the car door.
"He's your father, Toby. He's here because he wants to see you."
His mother responded in a monotone voice, trying to sound less shanky. Yet didn't drive up to the hospital to see Lyra before she died. Toby narrowed his eyes out to the window.
He was drunk that night, honey. He couldn't drive.
Yeah. When is he not? Toby pushed the door open before his mother and stumbled out into the driveway, where he met his father's gaze before looking down at his feet with a stern expression. His mother stepped out behind him and met her husband's eyes before walking out to the car. His father opened up his arms, expecting a hug from his wife, but she walked past him and put her arms around Toby's shoulders and started leading him inside. "Connie!" her husband began in a raspy voice. "What's no welcome home hug, huh?" She ignored her husband's obnoxious words and walked past him with her son under her arm. "Hey! He's 16, he can walk by himself." His father began to follow him in.
He's 17.
Connie glared back at him before opening the door to the house and stepping inside. Go.
Toby, why don't we get you in your room to rest, okay? I'll come get you when dinner's ready.
No, I'm 16. I can walk by myself. Toby said sarcastically and glared back at his father, stumbling up the small staircase and turning into his room, where he slammed the door violently. His little room didn't have much in it. It's just a small bed, a dresser, a window, and his walls had a few picture frames of his family, back when they were a family. Before his father became an alcoholic and acted violently towards the rest of his family, Toby remembered when he was arguing with his mother, and he grabbed her by the hair and shoved her into the floor. And that's when Lyra had tried to break it up. He pushed her and she hit her back in the corner of the kitchen counter. Toby could never forgive him for what he did to his mother and sister. Never! Toby didn't care how much his father beat him down. He couldn't even feel it anyways. What he did care is about how he unintentionally hurt the only two people he cared about. And when he was waiting in the hospital where his sister took her last breaths, the only one who didn't rush there was his dad. Toby stood by the window and looked out the streets. He could have sworn he saw something out of the corner of his eye, but quickly blamed it on the meds he was on. When dinner time had come and his mother called him, Toby came downstairs and hesitantly sat down at the table across from his father, and between his mother an empty chair. It was quiet as his parents picked at their food, but Toby refused to eat and said he just watched his dad with a blank stare. His mother caught on to his staring and elbowed him slightly. Toby took over at the slightly and then down at the uneaten food, which he still didn't touch. Toby laid in bed. He pulled his covers over his head and stared at the window. He was tired, but there was no way he could fall asleep. He couldn't. There was too much to think about. He had been debating on whether or not to follow his mother's directions and forgive his father, or continue holding a grudge with a boiling hatred. He heard his door cracked open and his mother padded into the room and sat to the bed next to him. She reached over and rubbed his back, which he had turned to her.
I know it's hard, Toby. Trust me, I understand. But I promise you it will get better.
She said softly. When is he going to leave? Toby said in an innocent tone in his shaky voice. Connie let her gaze fall down to her feet.
I don't know, honey. He's staying as far as I know.
she replied. Toby didn't respond. He just continued to look forward at the wall, holding his damaged arm near his chest. After a few minutes of silence, his mother sighed before she leaned in to kiss his cheek and stood up for a walk out of the room.
Good night,
she said as the door closed. The hours passed slowly, and Toby couldn't quit tossing and turning. Every time he let his imagination take over, he heard the screeching of tires, the screaming of his sister, and he would uncontrollably jerk in bed. He threw off his cover and laying down on his back, putting his pillow over his face, and cried into it. He could hear his own pitiful weeping. He would have been screaming and crying if he didn't press his pillow over his face. After a few seconds, he threw the pillow off his face and sat up, hunched over, holding his head and breath roughly, tears streaming from his eyes. He couldn't help but cry. He tried to keep it in, but he couldn't stop whining and whimpering as he sat there shaking. He inhaled before he stood up and walked around his bed to the window and peered out, taking a deep breath, trying to calm down. He rubbed his eyes and looked out the group of tall pine trees across the street. He stopped suddenly and his gaze slowly centered on something. Standing under the streetlight, he heard ringing in his ears and he couldn't look away. The figure stood beside the streetlight, about 2 feet shorter than it did, long arms draped at its side as it stared up on him at non-existing eyes. The figure had no facial features to speak of, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, yet it held Toby's hypnotized stare, seemingly peering into his very being. The ringing in his ears grew louder and louder each second he stared before suddenly it all went black. The next morning, Toby woke in his bed. He felt different. He wasn't tired at all, and he consciously woke up. It felt like he had been lying there for hours. He had no thoughts flowing through his mind. He sat up slowly and stumbled over a wall, but when he stood automatically, he felt dizzy. He stumbled to the doorway and walked down the stairs. His parents were still sitting at the table. His father turned on the small TV and sat on the countertop, and his mother was reading a newspaper. She quickly looked over and she felt Toby's presence looming behind her.
Well, good morning, sleepyhead. You've been sleeping forever.
She greeted him with a hesitant smile. Toby slowly looked over at the clock and noticed it was 12:30 p.m.
I made you breakfast, but it got cold. I was going to wake you up, but I thought you needed sleep.
Her expression felt like happy to worried as her son resisted responding to her.
Are you alright?
Toby stumbled and sat by his father. He felt as if he was on idle and he had no control over his actions. He was seeing everything he did, but I didn't register in his brain properly. He reached out to his father's arm, but his hand ended up getting slapped. His father turned to him abruptly and pushed his chair over with his foot. "Don't touch me, boy!" he yelled. His mother stood up.
Alright, knock that off. That is the last thing we need.
The days went by and things continued on as they were. Connie spent most of her time cleaning the house, and her rude husband spent most of the time ordering her around. It was just like how it used to be before the crash. Toby never really left his room. He would sit by his bed and tremble. His mind would wander, but his thoughts changed too fast to be remembered. He would pace around his small room like a cage, animal, or stared out the window. The unhealthy cycle continued. Connie continued to be pushed around by her husband, being way too submissive to him, and Toby remained in his room. Before he could think twice, he would begin to chew his hand, tearing the flesh from his fingers. He would gnaw his hands until they bled. When his mother walked in on him while he was doing so, she reacted horribly. She rushed him downstairs and grabbed a first aid kit, wrapping his hands in bandages. Afterward, she demanded that he wouldn't leave her side again. Toby isolated himself so much that he grew to hate being around others. His memories grew glitchy as well. He'd start missing memories of minutes, hours, days, and so on. He would begin talking nonsense about things completely unrelated to the conversation. He would have gone off about things, sharks and in the sink, as he washed the dishes, hearing crickets in the pillows, and seeing ghosts outside the bedroom window. His mother grew so anxious about his mental health that she decided it would be good for him to talk to a professional about how he was feeling. Connie walked Toby into the building, holding his hand and guiding him in. She walked up to him in the front desk and began to talk to the lady who sat behind it.
Miss Rogers?
The lady asked.
Yes, that's me.
Connie nodded.
We're here to see Dr. Oliver. I'm here with Toby Rogers. Yes, right this way.
The lady stood and led them down a long hallway. Toby looked at the framed artwork down the hall and turned in the sound of the lady's high heels on the hardwood floor. She opened the door to the room with a table with 2 chairs.
If we can get him to sit here for a few minutes, I'll get the doctor.
She smiled and held the door open. Toby stumbled into the room and sat down on the table. He looked over at his mother, and the lady before him shut the door slowly behind them. He looked around the room before he held up his tight bandages in his hands and began to bite the bandages to unwrap his hands. But he was interrupted as the door swung open and a young woman in black and spotted dress with light blonde hair stepped in, holding a clipboard and a pen.
Toby?
She asked with a smile. Toby looked up at her and nodded.
Nice to meet you, Toby. My name is Dr. Oliver.
She put her hand out in front of him and shaked the hand, but hesitantly pulled away when she noticed his bandaged hands.
Oh.
She smiled so nervously before clearing her throat and sitting in the chair across from the table from him.
So, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Try to answer them as honestly as possible, okay?
She placed her clipboard down on the table. Toby nodded slowly and held his restrained hands in his lap.
How old are you, Toby?
17, he responded quietly. She wrote down on the paper that was a clip to the clipboard.
What is your full name?
Toby Aaron Rogers.
When's your birthday?
April 28th.
Who's your immediate family?
Toby paused for a minute before answering her question. My mom, my dad, and... He stopped. My sister?
I heard you about your sister, dear. I'm really sorry.
Her expression faded into sad, pitiful look. Toby nodded.
Do you remember anything from the crash, Toby?
Toby looked away from her. His mind went black for a moment. He looked down at his lap and in surrounding areas, he heard a faint ringing sound. His eyes winded and froze in place.
Toby?
The counselor asked.
Toby, are you listening?
Toby felt shivers down his spine. He felt froze once up again and slowly looked over out to the little window through the door, where he saw it, a dark, featureless figure peering in at him. He stared, his eyes widened, the ringing growling louder and louder, and suddenly the loud voice of the counselor broke his trance.
Toby!
She yelled. Toby jumped and fell sideways out of his chair and back up into the corner. Dr. Oliver stood up, holding the clipboard to her chest, a surprised look in her eyes. Toby met her eyes again. His breath hitched and as he twitched. That night, Toby lay in his bed. His eyes were dazed as he stared straight into the ceiling. He could feel himself begin to doze off when he heard the scattering of the footsteps down the hallway. He sat up and looked towards the doorway, his door wide open. There was no light. Everything was lit by a luminescent blue glow of the moon through the window, leaving a cold lighting. He stood up slowly, made his way towards the doorway. Suddenly the door, which previously was wide open, slammed in his face. He grasped and fell back. He was out of breath when he hit the ground and began breathing heavily. His eyes wide open, he waited for a few seconds before getting back on his feet. He reached out and grasped the cold door handle with his bandage, had it cracked open. He looked out to the dark hallway and tiptoed out the room. The window at the end of the hallway lit up in darkness with blue moonlight as he paddled his way down. He could hear footsteps rustling around him and a faint giggling, followed by the pitter-patter of small feet, which sounded like a child that had run in front of him. Giggled and ran around the hallway. The hallway was no longer than he remembered. It seemed endless, like the ride home from the hospital. He heard the door creak in front of him. "Mom?" he called in a shaky voice. Suddenly a door slammed behind him, and he jumped and turned around. Behind him he heard a long, eerie groan that sounded like croak right in his ears. He turned around as fast as he could and was suddenly face to face with none other than his dead sister. Her eyes were clouded and wide. Her skin was pale. The right side of her jaw was dangling there by tissue and muscle. Glass protruded from her forehead, black blood leaking down her face. Her blonde hair pulled up in a ponytail as it always was, and she was wearing her gray t-shirt and an athlete short, which were dirty and spotted with blood. Her legs were bent in a way they shouldn't be. She stood emitting a long croaking noise, only an inch away from Toby's face. Toby yelped and fell back. Ah! He started to crawl backwards away from her, but he was unable to break the eye contact he held with her blank, dead eyes. He dangled himself backwards until he backed up to something. He stopped for a second. Everything went dead silent, except for his heavy breathing and crying. He slowly looked up to meet the blanket face of a tall figure. The same figure that stood over him now. Behind the tall, dark mask were rows of children looking so range from 3 to 10 years old. Their eyes were completely black and dark. Black blood leaked from their eye socket. He screamed and stood up fast as he could, only to be tripped by the dark treadles that wrapped around his ankle. He fell straight on his stomach and got the wind knocked out of him. He tried to scream, but he couldn't make a sound. He wheezed out before it all went black. Toby woke with a start. He screamed out and sat up as fast as he could, completely short of breath. He wheezed out and held his chest with his bandaged hands. It was just a dream. Just a dream. He lay back down on his bed and rolled over to his side. It felt like against weight had been lifted off his chest as he looked deep in and took a deep breath. He stood up with a padded over to his window. He saw nothing. Nobody was out there. No ghosts, no figure, nothing. He heard some rustling and coughing of his father outside the doorway. His door was closed. He walked over and opened it, looking out in the hallway once again. He padded down the hallway and into the kitchen, where he found his dad standing and having a smoke in the living room. Toby waited for a second and watched him from around the corner before a burning feeling started deep in his chest. Deep boiling anger overtook him. He heard a little imaginary voice in his head. Do it! Do it! Do it! They chanted. He turned away and held his arms. He felt like he actually had control over himself, unlike he did in the past few weeks since he got home from the hospital. He actually had a complete thought for just a moment before the chatting of a little voice in his head clouded him. Kill him. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. Kill him. Kill him. They continued on. Toby trembled. No, no. He wasn't going to do it. What? Was he going crazy? No. He won't kill anyone. He can't. He hated his father, but there's no way he was going to kill him. That was it. The last thought he had before he fell into an idle state once again. The influence of his voice in his head was too much. He began to silently walk up behind his father. He reached over the counter to the knife in the case. He gripped it in his hands. He felt the sensation take over his chest. He let out a snicker. He began laughing so hard he had to grasp for breath. His father turned around abruptly before he felt a brute force shoved him to the floor. He grunted as the air was knocked out of him. What? He looked at the boy who stood over him, grasping the kitchen knife in his hand. Toby, what are you doing? He went up to sit up and put him in his arms out in front of him in self-defense, but before Toby knew it, was on top of him. He went to grab his neck, but his father reached out and blocked his hands by grabbing onto his wrist. Stop! Get off of me, you little fucker! He yelled, and with his other hand, he threw off a off-center punch towards Toby's shoulder, but he didn't stop. The look in Toby's eyes was not sane. It looked as if the demon had taken control over him. He yelled back and went to stab the knife into his father's chest, but his father blocked him and grabbed onto his wrist once again. He shoved him back, but Toby kicked his feet out in front of him and landed a hard, low blow straight into his father's face. His father recoiled and put his arms away to cuff his face, but Toby got back up and drove the knife straight into his shoulder. His father let out a cry and went to pull out the knife, but before he could, Toby threw his fist straight into his face. He began to pound his fist into his head, laughing and wheezing and cracking his neck and grabbing the knife and ripped it out of his father's shoulder. He drove it deeper into his dad's chest and repeatedly stabbing into the torso, blood spilling out and getting splattered everywhere. He didn't stop until his father's body went still. He threw the knife over to the side and leaned over his body, coughing and panting. He stared at his father's smashed-in face and sat there twitching until a loud scream broke the silence. He looked over to see his mother standing a few feet away, covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face.
Toby,
She screamed.
why'd you do that?
She cried.
Why?
She screamed. Toby stood up and began to back away from his father's bloody corpse. He began to back out of the kitchen. He looked down to the blood-soaking bandage on his hands and looked up at his mother one last time before he turned and ran out of the house. He ran into the garage and slammed his hands against the control panel on the wall and pushed the button to open the garage door. Before he ran out, he noticed his father's hatchet, which he had been hanging on the tool rack above the table, full of jars filled with grim old rusted nails and screws. One of the hatchets was new, had a bright orange handle and a shiny blade, and the others were old wooden handles and old dull blades. He grabbed both, looked down at the table, and saw a box of matches under the table with red gasoline tank. He held both of his hatchets into one hand and grabbed the matches and gasoline before running out of the garage. Down the driveway and up the streets, he approached the street lights that he could see out his own bedroom window. He heard police sirens at the distance. He turned around and red and blue flashing lights came rushing down the street. Toby stood for a second before he pulled open the cap of the gasoline tank and ran down the streets, spilling gasoline all over the street after him. He turned and ran into the trees. He poured a bit of gasoline out before he reached into his pocket and pulled out a match. He struck it against the box and immediately dropped it. In an instant, flames burst around him. The fire caught on the trees and the bushes around him, and before he knew it, it was surrounded by fire. The silhouette of police cars were visible through the flames. As he backed away into the forest around him, he looked around, but his vision was blurred. His heart was pounding, and he closed his eyes for a moment. This was it. This was the end. Toby felt his hands on his shoulders. He opened his eyes and looked over to see a large white hand with long bony fingers resting on his shoulder. He followed the arm that attached to the hand up to the dark, towering figure. It appeared to be wearing a dark black suit, and its face was completely blank. It towered over Toby's small frame as it looked down on him. Trindles reached out from the back. Before Toby knew it, his vision blurred, and he heard the sound of the ringings in his ears. Everything went blank. That was it. That was the end. That's how Toby Rogers died. A few weeks later, Connie sat down in his sister's kitchen. Her sister Lori sat next to her drinking a cup of coffee. About 3 weeks ago, Connie lost her husband and her son, and a few weeks before, she had lost her daughter to a car crash. Since then, she moved in with her sister. The police were keeping her busy. They had just finished cleaning up the case, and the story had been released 2 weeks ago. The focus of the world seemed to have shifted to completely new stories. Lori switched the TV on to the news broadcast. On the TV, the newest reporter began introducing the new headline. We have breaking news. Last night there had been reported of murders of 4 individuals. There are no suspects yet, but victims are a group of middle school kids who had been out in the woods late last night. The kids have been stabbed to death. The investigation had discovered a weapon at the crime scene. It appears to be old, dull blade hatchets, as you can see here. The picture changed to show snapshots of the weapon exactly as it was left at the crime scene. Investigators have pulled the name of a possible subject, Toby Rogers, a 17-year-old boy who stabbed his father to death a few weeks ago and tried to cover up his escape by setting a fire in the streets and forest area around the neighborhood. Although they believe that the young boy had died in the fire, investigators suspect Rogers might still be alive due to the fact that his body was never found.